Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today I'm painting another Bob Ross classic, this time Hideaway Cove, and it was a suggestion by one of you, my lovely subscribers. And it's a really good painting because it has a little bit of everything. Okay, so there's not many clouds in it, but there's a pretty sky, there's a classic Bob Ross mountain, some nice fir trees, and of course some of those bushes to paint that Bob used to do with a 1-inch brush. Now, I know people struggle to paint those, so I spent a little bit of extra time filming the technique that I use to reproduce the same technique that Bob used. So, sit back and relax. Cup of tea, notepad at the ready, maybe don't hide away those brushes, get them out and see if we can paint Hideaway Cove together. Another Bob Ross classic. So here's my canvas, 16 inches by 20 as usual. And for those with quick eyes, you've spotted these two map pins. This gives me the horizon line. Today I'll be using Bob Ross liquid white oil paint over the entire canvas. I'll be using 2 or 3 old 1-inch Bob Ross brushes for the backgrounds and a nice 1-inch Bob Ross brush for highlighting. I'll also be using a liner, a filbert and a fan, but I didn't use the filbert in the end. And also a Bob Ross palette knife. So let's get started. I use one of my older 1-inch brushes just to scrub on some liquid white. Be sure to apply this thin and evenly. Before I paint, I always test my canvas by touching the canvas with my fingertips. That's perfect, just the right amount. But I'll leave a video to a how-to up here in the corner. Don't forget, rub out those fingerprints. And dry clean that 1-inch brush. You'll be amazed at how much liquid white is lurking in the bristles. Here's my palette, and it's, well, not complete yet, but I've got enough here to get started. And my first colour is this one, cadmium yellow. I pull out a small amount and tap my brush well into the paint. I want to make a nice bright glowing yellow colour through the centre of my sky. Make it a little bigger than you need it to be. You'll see why in a moment. And of course, you need to reflect it in the water. Long strokes pulling to the centre. I leave a little unpainted. That could be a shimmer of light across the surface of the water. Now, straight into bright red. Don't bother dry cleaning that brush. We want a nice peachy orange colour. I want this colour to bump into and sort of shake hands with the cadmium yellow. Now you understand why you needed more yellow at the start. Repeat the pulling in stroke from the edge to the centre for the red colour. My next colour is lavender, and for this I need about 5 parts crimson, 1 part phthalo blue. Mix this up very well on your palette. There, that's the sort of colour I'm looking for. Not too blue, not too red. And I'm going to start up here in the corner. Do a little test first. If it's either too blue or too red, then adjust your colours. This colour will work well with red, but keep it away from the yellow. The blue, I'm afraid, will cause a green reaction. Now, drop some in the water as well. You can really see that shimmer working for me now. I use the same brush and go into some Prussian blue. And again, just a small amount, just to tint the sky slightly. This is a very subtle sky. It needs lots of blending. There, with a clean dry brush, I want to bring everything together with nice long flat strokes. Finally, a few clouds. I add a small amount of black to my lavender. Again, mix it well. I just want a sort of dark shadowy purple colour, not black. And you saw how I loaded my brush. I just laid it on its side and just tapped. Now you see I lay my brush at an angle, about 45 degrees, and just gently tap on the canvas to leave a small amount of paint. Then go back to that blending brush. It's my nice new 1-inch brush, and pull gently from the edge to the centre. Notice how far you can pull that paint. You can make long subtle clouds. Time to paint a mountain. I start out with some Prussian blue, some black, some alizarin crimson, some Van Dyke brown, okay, dark sienna, and then some, in in a blink of an eye, Van Dyke brown, I knew I'd forgotten something on this palette, and mix it together well. I'm looking for a dark grey colour, so check your palette carefully. Once you're happy, I put it up where the Prussian blue is and give this area a clean. Now, for some planning, you know I like to plan my paintings well. I take a little dot of that dark grey colour and I want to come in about maybe a quarter in from the right, maybe a little further to the left. And I leave a good space above the mountain in case I want to grow things. So yeah, I suppose I've ended up about a third the way across the canvas. And as you can see, I just use the point of my knife just to sketch in the rough shape of the mountain. Now take a little roll of that dark grey colour and with firm pressure put your finger on the back of the knife and really press this paint down into the canvas. I can't emphasise this enough. We're staining the canvas, we're not leaving a thick trail of paint. I think people get into more trouble with their mountains by leaving just too much colour on the canvas. As you see, I've scraped out nearly everything. The final step is to gently brush out the remainder of the paint. I lay my brush in the angle of the mountain and just gently sweep to the sides, aiming for those pins. Leave the darkest area of the mountain at the peaks. Don't drag it all the way down to the pin line. You'll see why in a minute. Let's take a moment to look at highlighting our mountain. If this peak has a nice ridge running down the centre of it, just here, and I were a skier coming this side, I'd be in highlight, nice and warm with my sunglasses on. Whereas the skier on this side of the ridge, well, he'd be in the shadow and quite cold. So we need a highlight with a little bit of white, black and a tiny bit of red. And this gives us a nice sort of mauvish colour. I'll warm it up with a little bit of dark sienna. I take a small roll of paint on the edge of my palette knife. Let's have a closer look at that. There, see how it stands up off my knife blade? And notice now how I hold my knife at a steep angle at the start of the stroke. This is important because you want the paint to break. You don't want to drop all the paint at the top of the mountain peak. There, notice how my handle slowly drops towards the canvas as the stroke progresses. I add some more paint to my mountain. Again, no pressure on that knife blade. The canvas will take what it wants and give you back the rest. For a shadow colour, a little white and some Prussian blue, and again, gentle pressure here. Just let the knife float. There. I think some fine tuning is in order. Even Bob would come back and have a little play with the mountain edges, and I like to do the same. I use the small blade of my knife just to add a little extra highlight here and there. And finally some mist. Now you can see why I didn't want all that dark colour down near the pins. I'm going to create some little background trees, and again some more of that lavender colour. Crimson, phthalo blue, this time a little white. I want these trees to look more distant. I groom my fan brush well. Make sure the bristles are well stuck together. Now these little trees live in this gap between the base of the mountain and the pins, and to keep me sort of in a really good position with my trees, I like to put a few little markers on. I can't tell you how many times my trees have grown too big and swallowed my mountain. Now, notice how I hold the fan brush. I want just the very top corner of my fan brush to strike the canvas, and I let it skid. This produces a nice fine point to my distant fir trees. I want to add lots of them. Vary the heights, but take notice of where you put your little marker trees on. Now, for some mist. I've gone back to one of my 1-inch brushes, this time with a little bit of titanium white on it, and notice how I strike down just to diffuse the base of those trees. Now, try clean the brush and then give a few little upward flicks. It just gives the trees a nice little point. The reflections are exactly the same, but instead going down instead of up. Blend them out well and then gently brush across. finally a waterline. I tap my palette knife into some titanium white paint. It's got a little lavender in it, but actually that's an advantage. I don't want this waterline to be too bright. Now, firm pressure, really push on that knife blade and zigzag across the surface of the water to create a few little ripples. Now, this dark colour that I made quite a bit of it. I'm going to be using this for my fir trees. Add some phthalo green and a little sap green. Well, okay then, a big chunk of sap green. It doesn't really matter. We're looking for a nice dark green forest colour. Once again, I put my fan brush through this colour and I take a little bit of my highlighting colour from the mountain. I want this colour to be a subtle green colour, not too strong. These are for some background fir trees. Once again, I like to mark the positions. Not too big or too small. And maybe one here as well. And we'll see if that one fits. And this little group of trees want to be below the pin lines for the background trees. So they're getting a little closer to us in the painting. They will be mid-ground than background. Notice how I drop my handle down at an angle and just tap with the corner of my fan brush. I've made some videos about painting fir trees, so I put a link down in the description below. Now these, as I mentioned, are background trees. I don't need to paint all of them, just the tops. There. And another one. Give them a friend, and there maybe one more. There. Give my brush a dry clean. I've gotten rid of that contaminated colour and I'm now using just straight dark green. These trees are closer to us in the painting, so the colour wants to be full dark green colour. Things that are further away tend to be pale in tone, like those distant trees in the background of my painting. Notice how far away they look now. Once again, I'm painting my fir tree using a little pressing action. Don't let the brush skid. The bristles of the fan brush and the thick dark green paint leave a little texture that resembles pine needles hanging down from the tree branches. Notice how I let my tree grow in width till I reach that little marker I put across the canvas. I give my big tree some little friends, and a neat little trick here is to add some little distant trees in the background, but they're not really there. I just use my palette knife just to indicate the tops of some little trees. It's just an illusion. And I run my knife up the centre just to put a little point on each of those small trees. Now, I've got a little bit of the brown colour from my mountain highlighting, and I'm going to put in the suggestion of a tree trunk. So just here and there, down the middles of the biggest trees, I add a little touch of highlight. These trees need reflections, but you don't have to be too careful. Just the rough position is about right. Make sure the scale is similar to the trees above. Then with a clean dry brush, press and pull straight down. Dry clean the brush and then pull across edge to centre. Take care not to pull from the opposite direction. You'll leave a dirty mark in the water. No, that won't do at all. Edge to centre. I've got a second fan brush and I'm going to make some highlights. Cadmium yellow, sap green and a tiny touch of phthalo green, but be careful, it's a very bright colour. Notice how I load my fan brush by pushing into the paint. I want a little tiny ridge of paint on the edge of the brush. Now, with the light coming from the left, I want to highlight mainly the left side of my fir trees. A little bit in the centre and nothing much to the right of the centre. Decide which trees get highlight and which trees remain in the shadows. I'm going to add some bushes and a riverbank at the base of these trees, so don't let the highlights go too low. Save a little shadow. Now, for bushes, I take a 1-inch brush. Notice how it's been manufactured with a rounded side and a crimped side. I like to use my brush in one direction and pull it through the paint rounded side first. This trains the hairs of my brush to behave in a certain way. Now, here's my palette and my brush, and as you see, I'm going to pull my brush through the highlight colour in one direction. Notice how I lean the handle away from me to splay the bristles apart. I changed the angle of the camera so you can see this a little better. I lean the brush handle away and really get those bristles to open up. Rounded side now goes to the top. So gentle pressure, just gently touch and let the bristles leave a little imprint. Don't let the brush skid. I do the same for some reflections, just touch and press. And then with a fairly clean dry 1-inch brush, I gently brush down and across for some reflections. I'll repeat this again a little later in the painting. Now for a riverbank, I start with Van Dyke brown on my palette knife, and with again gentle pressure, I just sculpt where I think the muddy bank sits underneath these bushes, and I pull at a slight angle with my palette knife. A little wider on the left, narrower on the right. For my highlight, I use some grubby white paint, a little Indian yellow and some sienna. Again, just marble mixed, don't overdo it, it just goes to a flat caramel colour. Once again, just like highlighting a mountain, little rolls of paint, and then for a final touch, I pulled out a tiny little reflection of that little muddy bank, and finish it off with some water lines. So I'm really pleased with the way my painting is progressing. I got a nice mountain, some nice distant fir trees because they're nice and pale in colour, and a nice little group of trees, bushes, even some little weeds and some reflections. But I want to concentrate on this section next, and I'm going to go across the details for painting bushes again, because I know it's something you struggle with. This little 1-inch brush, you need to make friends with it if you're going to paint good Bob Ross bushes. So let's carry on. Now, for the right hand side, we're going to have a nice big tree, some more bushes and a path, but first let's do some planning. My pathway could look like this, but there's a problem. The perspective's wrong, the angle is too steep and the path doesn't grow wide enough. Even that doesn't work, it's just too skinny and too upright. No, we need to redraw this. Okay, now let's try it at a shallow angle. That looks a bit more promising, and again growing a little wider, but it's still a bit sort of narrow. That looks even better, but this is something I see often. The pathway doesn't look like it's laying flat, the highlights go uphill. Let's have one more go, see if we can get this right. So a nice shallow angle, growing nice and wide, nice and quickly, and when I put the highlights on, they want to be horizontal. Now my path looks like it's going back into the distance and something I could walk on. I want a nice tall fir tree here, and in Bob's original painting, Hideaway Cove, he just had half a tree. So that's what I'll do. I'm just going to tap with the corner of my fan brush, imagining that the other half of the tree is in the background. Now you can see why I didn't overdo it with the highlights on my mountain. I knew I was going to put a tree here, so I sort of underdid that area and I didn't bother tinkering with it. I want a nice sort of shapely tree here, so I started a little smaller and I can always grow it slightly wider. I think that's about right, but well, this looks a bit wrong. In Bob's original painting, he grew it off the top of the canvas, and I have too. I had highlights and a tree trunk, just as I had done before. Now, let's think about those bushes again. Rounded side towards me, I pull the brush, leaning the handle away from me to splay the bristles open. Pull it in one direction, give the brush a little press, and have a look at this palette. You can see the imprint of the bristles there. It means that on the end of my brush, I have hundreds of little points of paint, all adding texture to my bushes. Now, again, rounded side to the top. Go straight into the canvas and think about a press and push, but don't let the brush slide. I like to think I'm painting a clock face, so I just work my way round from the centre outwards, pressing and letting the bristles return to the centre again to create this lovely shape. This is the way we add a dark sticky underpainting texture for a highlight to stick to, because we know a thin paint will stick to a thick paint. My highlight is nice and thin and oily. And again, thinking about where the light comes from on the left, I highlight that part of the bush first. Again, it was loaded, rounded side first, and then gentle pressure on the brush just to leave an imprint of the bristles. Top tip: before you load your brush with more highlight, just give it a little flick on some paper towel to knock off any dark. Remember, leave some shadow in those bushes. Don't overfill them. It doesn't take long before they're over highlighted. Now, I put on some Van Dyke brown for my path, using horizontal strokes. Now, for the same highlight as we used in the background, again, just drag the paint across the pathway. Let the knife travel horizontally. It's surprising how much of a difference it makes to the way the paint lays and how realistic the path will look. To soften the edge of the path, I had a few little weeds using the corner of my fan brush. I also completed that far right hand corner with some more bushes. Now, scratchy sticks and twigs really bring the painting all together. I like to use the edge of my palette knife to make a few little details as well, but don't tell anybody how we did them. It'll be our secret. There. So there we have it. Hideaway Cove, a Bob Ross classic, and the special guest star, of course, is Poppy Cat. Come to see what I'm doing. And of course, I need to add a little bit of an extra special twist. It could be Poppy Cat, I guess, but no, she's off to bed. So there you have it, Hideaway Cove, another Bob Ross classic with a little bit of an extra twist from yours truly. But don't move, there's another lovely painting coming right along. Happy painting, people!